Should I get started? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So
Yeah, I'm sure people will make their way in.
So thank you so much for joining us, Daniel. So why don't you start us off by giving a brief context of what you're doing currently and about your association, and then
Absolutely.
go straight to the talk.
Yes.
Okay.
So I think it's important for all of you to know where exactly I'm coming from in terms of the distinguishing my academic interest in China's relations with Nepal and my work at Yale University. So for starters, I work for the Yale-China Association, which is a nonprofit Yale affiliate, and our programs focus exclusively on fostering long-term relationships between Yale University students and faculty, particularly those who focus on East Asian studies, and also our program partners that are in China, particularly in Changsha, Chinese University of Hong Kong. So essentially where my interest in Nepal and China came from is a combination of my own academic interest, particularly with focusing so much of my time on China and with recent developments in terms of the earthquake in China extending its own aid to help, and also in terms of the fuel crisis. That made me increasingly interested in different developments that occur in terms of the One Belt, One Road initiative over the last 4 years. And even decades ago when China first started building roads during the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s. The last thing is that I also have a personal connection with Nepal in that my partner is Newar. She is a practicing architect who now is based in Brooklyn. And during her master's thesis, she also studied window architecture in the Kathmandu Valley. So she has a lot more to tell me about structures than I would ever understand. And at the same time, I also talk a lot about politics in both China and Nepal. So we definitely have had a lot to teach each other over the years. But I just wanted to start off by explaining where my inspiration for looking closely at China and Nepal's relations came from. So this first appeared in Time magazine during the 2015 earthquake, and it was focused on the Taiwan government's aid being snubbed by Nepal's government in regards to the question of the article today was whether Nepal had refused Taiwan's aid because they focus on the One China policy, and they have always promoted that ideology since the 1950s, or it was just a complete misunderstanding. But nevertheless, the fact that Taiwan was being refused this aid while at the same time China was coming in with all of their different forms of supply and personnel to help out with the earthquake relief, it really explains how someone like me, who focuses a lot of my time on China, really became fascinated with these different kinds of developments. And I also, just to compare the amount of aid that China sent versus the amount of aid that India sent, it also will provide some context to the rest of my talk, especially given that India provided the largest amount of personnel according to these UN statistics during the time of the earthquake, with over 500, and then at the same time you have China coming in 8th place with about 16 personnel and 6 K9 units, and at the same time you have several other countries from Asia that helped out around the same lines, like Japan, Singapore, and then at the top with Russia, Israel, and Poland. Well, the US has been below China in terms of aid, but around the same number. So especially during that time, the earthquake had caused many countries, even neighboring countries, to send roughly the same amount of aid, with the exception of course, India having such long historic ties. But another development in 2015 will in many ways offset this trend of Indian dominance in terms of sending aid. So some of you may already be familiar with this history, but I think it's also essential to understand the 20th century politics of the Nepali government, especially from the 1960s to the 1990s. They were under They panchayat, a so-called democracy, where it was simply a very entrenched bureaucracy that was tightly controlled by the monarchy, and all political parties were banned. But I think it's important to note that a lot of these parties were still established during the 1950s, and then during a brief experiment in the early 1960s, they did have a flourishing with elections, and then they were quickly suppressed, and Mahendra, who is pictured here, said that there won't be any more elections, any more political parties, and this remained the case until around 1990, where you have the uprising to inspire the creation of a constitutional monarchy that will allow these kinds of elections to occur. And particularly you have the Nepali Congress, which I considered the more socialist party, and then the Communist Party of Nepal, United Marxist-Leninists, which despite its communist roots was still very favorable to a constitutional monarchy compared to the Maoist Party, which I'll explain below. And at the same time, even today, these parties still remain very prominent entities in Nepali politics. And of course, lastly, you have the Communist Party of Nepal, the Maoist Center, which when it was first established in 1994, was just known as the Maoists, and they were deeply inspired by Maoist ideology that was disseminated during the 1950s, 1960s, when you have Chinese laborers who came over and they brought with them different texts written by Mao Zedong. And there were also some translations of those texts into Nepali language, which I'll show a little bit more of later. But essentially these Maoists caused an uprising because they were dissatisfied with the current constitutional monarchy system from the early 90s, and the Civil War went on for over 10 years, and it ultimately culminated, even though there was a treaty made in 2005, you still had various uprisings that called for the overthrow of the monarchy from both the Maoists and also from the Nepali Congress and the UML supporters. So that created a situation where the Constitutional Assembly had to be created and the monarch of Nepal, Gyanendra, had to be overthrown in 2008. But it's important to note, though, that these two communist parties, the UML and the Maoist Party, they have both been recently combined following the 2017 elections into a single Communist Party of Nepal. So they are now one party. Sorry, I meant these two. And then you have the Nepali Congress representing the more moderate social party, and in some ways the more conservative party. Now another way to understand this from the last 10 years I would show is how Xi Jinping, throughout his entire tenure as the president of China, you have also seen several different prime ministers from several different parties take up the mantle of trying to create a new system of government in Nepal, from several different constituent assemblies to finally establishing a parliament in 2015. So 2012, 2013, and 2016, 2017, you have the Communist Party of Nepal Maoist Center with Baburam Bhattarai, who was a doctorate who received education in India, but he was also very instrumental in the ideologic roots of the Maoist Party. And then you have the ultimate leader of the Maoists, Prachanda or Pushpa Kamal Dahal, who was also very influential in inciting those uprisings and creating the civil war. Next up, you have the Nepali Congress with Korala and Duba. Duba especially has created a reputation for himself because he presided over several administrations when there was still a constitutional monarchy, especially during the Civil War. And there have been many criticisms with him that he has been very complacent with the monarchy's handling of the Civil War that led to several atrocities. In no short part, the Maoists have also been accused of atrocities on their side, but because Duba actually held the prime ministership for the early 2000s, he comes under a lot of fire, even though he still has had some term in the prime minister's seat. And then lastly, and I think this would be the most critical figure, is Kagda Prasad Oli, who is the head of the UML, but right now it's the Communist Party of Nepal that has combined both his party and Bhattarai and Prachanda's party together. And it's important to note him especially because he has been the most favorable towards extending relations to China in terms of infrastructural projects, election assistance, access to different dry ports and seaports. So he's been very influential in this regard. Especially today, I think it's also important to talk a little bit about the two ambassadors to Nepal and China, because both of them have become very influential. You have Ambassador Yu Hong, who worked her way up through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is China's foreign service, and she's worked all the way from Scandinavia to South Africa, and she's recently became ambassador to Nepal. She's also given several talks about the need to restore different infrastructural projects following the earthquake, particularly entry points between China and Nepal. And then of course over here you have Leela Podel, who's definitely a very popular figure in Nepal, especially because of his Clean the Bigmati River campaign, and also because he had a long stint as Consul General of the Tibet Autonomous Region in China. So he's also been at the forefront of issues related to Tibetan migration, whether legal or illegal. And of course, nowadays he is based in Beijing and was recently appointed just 2 years ago, I believe. So before I get more into how these increasing relations with China and Nepal have been established, I think it's important for all of us to understand and visualize just where the exports and imports come from, as well as the different materials that they have. So this here is from the Observatory of Economic Complexity, and one of the things that I'd like to show all of you is the imports, and especially this figure right here, which is the refined petroleum. And many of these kinds of different kinds of imports have several different proportional differences, but especially in 2015, the figure of refined oil came into the forefront, especially when you click on further and see where does Nepal import refined petroleum from, and of course you get, well, first nothing. Here, let's see if I can get this on Google Chrome. India, 99.8%. So already you can, and of course this was taken 1 year after the fuel crisis that I will be describing in a moment, and then also in 2015, India also still comes at 97%. So it's clear how, in terms of the fuel that Nepal needs, especially for driving various vehicles, running different businesses that require a lot of heat, including jewelry and different kinds of businesses, you can see that India holds a lot of influence in that kind of trade. And then if you go back here, you also have China emerging as a close trade partner with still not able to upstate India's dominance, but definitely emerging to a considerable extent, especially when you see that a lot of the origins of Nepal's imports come from China, and then China represents Nepal's third top destination for exports. And then if we look at what does China import from Nepal, you have bells and other metal ornaments. There's even a song about Nepal bells that was made in Chinese by a popular artist. Knotted carpets, orthopedic appliances. So you have a wide variety of things, but it's important to understand that India has a large dominance over this kind of trade, but at the same time, China has been emerging. Now if we go back to the presentation, with Nepal and its One Belt, One Road initiative, one of the important things to understand is that it's really trying to promote trade and projects in terms of fuel trade, hydroelectric power, and railways. And even though at the time when I wrote this, just a couple of months back, I assumed because Nepal is a landlocked country, the policy of the One Belt, One Road, which incorporates both a land route and a maritime route, that the One Belt, One Road only applies to the One Belt for Nepal. But actually, because of different concessions in terms of China giving Nepal access to seaports, you also have a little bit of One Road element in terms of a maritime route that is given to Nepal. But with these different projects, it's interesting how China tries to connect Nepal despite it being a landlocked country, and also trying to allow it to balance its trade with India in terms of different kinds of seaport access and all of these kinds of projects listed here. So where all of this really came to a fray was in the 2015 fuel crisis, and I'm hoping that all of you are at least somewhat familiar with this crisis because it became a very big issue, especially when China decided to create an agreement with Nepal to give it more fuel, which was an unprecedented agreement at the time. So essentially what started the fuel crisis was a series of protests by the Madesi, and it should also say Tharu people on both ends of the Terai. So if you imagine Nepal from east to west, if you look at the borders on the eastern side, the western side, that border India, that's essentially where you get the hottest activity in terms of protests. Most of them were in regards to disproportionate representation in their new constitution. And at the same time, you have the controversy in terms of fuel trucks not being able to enter Nepal. And there may be some strong opinions about that here, but according to the Nepal opinion, it's simply that India, out of solidarity with the Madesi, was refusing to let any trucks enter. And even though there were protests blocking roads, Nepal's government believes they could easily still have entered into the country. At the same time, on the Indian government side, they just simply said, we were concerned for the safety of our drivers, particularly those who were carrying fuel trucks in and out of the country on a daily basis, and so we just did not want to let them in with all of these protests going on. So despite the actual reason for it, there was a large crisis, and you have these long lines that would go for miles trying to get fuel. Another personal example that I experienced was that even though my partner's family had suffered to a minor extent from the earthquake, they still made it out okay. So that was April in 2015. But by October 2015, because of this fuel crisis, it created a crippling situation for my partner's father's business, which is in bridal jewelry, many of which he exports to Japan and Denmark. But the fact is, if you don't have a lot of fuel, you can't really make a lot of fires to forge the jewelry. So I remember him having to make several trips to his trading partners, trying to explain the situation and where they are now in terms of honoring their various shipments. So to many people, if they didn't get impacted by the earthquake already, this fuel crisis was a huge blow, and arguably to a larger percentage of the population in terms of economic impact. At the same time, you have several different social media advocacy movements, particularly the hashtag #BackOffIndia from many different Nepalis, particularly those in the hill area around the Kathmandu Valley. At the same time, what China decided to do was in October, they decided to send 1.2 million liters of emergency fuel, and at the same time, they concluded a treaty between Xi Jinping and Oli that their goal would be to have China meet 33% of Nepal's annual demand of fuel. I don't think that goal has been reached yet, but it has been steadily increasing since that treaty has been made in March 2016. It's also important to note that by March 2016, the fuel crisis had largely ended, but Oli was still determined to proceed with these kinds of agreements with China. Another aspect of this has also been increased projects with hydroelectric power, particularly in the Budi Gandaki region, which is just northwest of Kathmandu. It's a 1,200 megawatt project that received a lot of controversy because when you had Oli in power in 2015, 2016, he gave the rights to the project to China's Guzhouba group, which makes a lot of infrastructural projects both in China and in several other countries. And then in the subsequent government, because again, there were many transitional governments, you have the Nepali Congress led by Duba that said, well, this is very questionable that they were allowed to build this project without a proper bidding process. So they decided they're not going to build it. Unfortunately for Duba, the Communist Party of Nepal won the 2017 elections. So right at the outset, once Oli got back in, he said, we're going to let Guzhouba develop this project because it goes with his administration's plan of increasing relations with China and trying to balance that with India. At the same time, you also have a very ambitious project to create a China-Nepal railway that goes from Shigatse, which is right here, just west of Lhasa, and you also have this even more ambitious project to try to create a tunnel that goes through the Himalayas into Kathmandu. And this is I can't even imagine it being able to even reach the Nepal border, let alone go through the Himalayas, but there have been several different proposals for this, most recently in June 2018 when she and Oli talked more about this. But so far, the railway has only gone up to, I would say, between Lhasa and Shigatse, and so it's still a long way down from completion. And I'm also very skeptical about the amount of infrastructural resources that would allow them to even not just get through the Himalayas on the China side, but also connect it to Kathmandu, especially with all these transitions in various governments. But it's estimated that this project will be 238 billion RMB, particularly according to the Renmin University of Economic Resource Center, which is in Beijing. You also have some initiatives that go beyond the One Belt, One Road. You have 2 joint military exercises between the Nepali Army and the People's Liberation Army of China. The first one was in April 2017, but on a more controversial level, you have the September 2018 one, which was much more difficult for India because they had also agreed to a similar joint military exercise, but around the same time it was scrapped, but the exercise seen here was allowed to continue. So as you can imagine, India was not very happy that it was snubbed in favor of a China-Nepali exercise. At the same time, you have an issue in terms of these exercises being to curb anti-China counter-terrorist activities, because when you mention those things, you inevitably think of Tibetan migration, particularly those who try to leave China illegally due to different conditions and different forms of police repression in the Tibet Autonomous Region. But of course, they always generally phrase this as anti-China activities and not anything specific to Tibet or specific to any activities from, say, northern India or Bhutan. It's just always been generally phrased as counterterrorism, anti-China, but in my view, it's always in regards to Tibetan migration. Lastly, you also have this very controversial initiative where during the 2017 local elections, you have China agreeing to give 9 million RMB to Nepal's government for election assistance. And to this day, I still haven't been able to figure out what exactly that assistance was used for. I can only conjecture that from the way India gives assistance, it could be in terms of transporting ballots, creating ballot boxes, and also being able to hire personnel. But of course, this is a very suspicious initiative given that the entire, or most of the country of Nepal went to the party that was most favorable towards relations to China. Understandably, this initiative was not reported in the mainland Chinese press. However, it was reported by several outer Chinese media outlets, such as the South China Morning Post, different Taiwan news outlets, and of course the Nepali local press was quick to pick up on it. So this did not fall on deaf ears, and I think people are still trying to scratch their heads over this kind of assistance for elections. So with what I was talking about before in terms of anti-China activities, it's impossible to discuss China's relationship with Nepal without addressing the impact that it has on Tibetan refugees. Now, Nepal is the country with the third largest Tibetan population, China, of course, being the first, India the second. And there's about, according to the 2009 statistics from different Tibetan refugee organizations, the Tibetan exile population was around 13,000. And at the same time, you have, especially in 2008, but it's still occurring on an infrequent basis, different forms of police suppression of Tibet protests in terms of how their colleagues or various family members are treated in the Tibet Autonomous Region. And of course, when I gave this to the China Forum, there were many Chinese present who were, of course, very skeptical about these kinds of issues, and many of them may not have heard about the mass diaspora of Tibetan refugees that occurred in the late 50s and early 60s, as well as the CIA-backed Khampa warriors that were present in the different areas bordering China, particularly in the Mustang region in bordering China. But it's important to address this issue because it's always been at the forefront of China's relations with Nepal, and the fact that they are always emphasizing that Nepal keep its emphasis on a one China policy, and that includes recognizing the Tibet Autonomous Region as a part of China and not supporting any free Tibet movements.
Question?
Yes.
That's all in quotes. Who's the quote from?
Yes, that is from the Human Rights Watch report Under China's Shadow. And it was originally published in 2008, but it was again updated in 2014. Of course, with all the protests that occurred during the Beijing Olympics, that's when it really came to the forefront, including in Nepal. But I think it was updated in 2014 due to these reoccurring suppression campaigns against different movements of free Tibet activism, or even just for protesting for better conditions in Tibet. It doesn't necessarily have to be advocating for independence. At the same time, the last sentence, there is no legal basis for these policies in terms of anti-China activities. The term anti-China activities has no meaning or force in Nepali law. So it's important to note that there's not really a legal basis for why Nepal suppresses these other than to play nice with China. But at the same time, for many of the Hill people in Nepal, they welcome the kind of support that China brings them, especially given the fuel crisis, and many people are all the more welcome to cater to different overtures of Chinese assistance if it means that India doesn't create another situation such as the fuel crisis. Another important aspect to a lot of these different issues is to show just how influential these different kinds of local elections had been on the different kinds of relations between China and Nepal. For example, you can see in many of these provinces, you see for these local elections, the United Marxist-Leninist Party winning the majority of seats in the provincial assembly and in the federal parliament in Kathmandu. So if there are different districts that you can also look at this by, but you can see that the UML had a large victory in 2017. This was considered the first local election since I believe the 90s or so. And at the same time, it was considered the first national election for their newly established constitution. And so you have the Communist Party of Nepal having a huge majority, and at the same time you have less of a victory for the Maoist Center and the Nepali Congress, which tend to be the more skeptical parties towards Chinese infrastructural initiatives. But the exception to this victory for the Communist Party of Nepal was in the Terai region, where the fuel crisis protests were very prominent. And in these kinds of areas, you have, you still have the UML, but you also have different minority parties, or at least less influential parties, but ones that reflect the ethnic demographics more so, winning, such as the SSF and other individual parties. But it's important to know that for most of Nepal, especially above the Terai region, it seemed like the Communist Party of Nepal won a landslide victory in 2017, except in the areas where the fuel crisis was a major contention point in 2015. So in many ways, I still think that so long as the Communist Party of Nepal retains majority, they will still be very successful in promoting these kinds of China-backed infrastructural projects. Maybe even for election assistance, they'll consider getting another loan for this kind of aid. At the same time, you have different military exercises. And the only sign that this kind of relationship was wavering was really with the Budai Gandaki plant's whole bidding process and everything, because even when they suffered a setback, the Communist Party still stepped in and said, we are going to give that corporation back its rights to the project. So as it stands now, at least in Nepal, there hasn't been many signs that the Belt and Road Initiative is wavering, at least to the current Nepali government. But at the same time, you still have plenty of concerns from the Chinese government, of course, in terms of infrastructural resources, particularly with post-earthquake reconstruction, which is still going on today. You can see many buildings just in Kathmandu alone that are being developed, including very many historical sites that China has been helping with rebuilding. You still have frequent changes in government leadership over the past few years, and I think China still wants more proof that the Communist Party of Nepal is able to retain the majority for at least 2 years, let alone just 1 year. So you also have concerns from neighboring countries in terms of different examples where the One Belt, One Road initiative has gone awry, particularly with Sri Lanka, Hambantota port, with a 99-year lease on this port, which to many seemed as though they were signing over their territory, and they were worried that it could be used as a Chinese naval base. At the same time, the state owes $8 million to Chinese state-controlled firms, which puts it in a lot of debt. As far as I know, Nepal is not in that kind of a debt trap situation so far, but these concerns still arise, particularly from the Nepali Congress. And then, of course, you have Pakistan, which owes China over $6 billion, and then the Daimar Basta Dam, which was recently canceled because they also had a concern about China's infrastructural development and the process by which they acquired the rights to it, similar to how Nepal's own project was temporarily suspended and around the same time. And then, of course, lastly, you have the concerns from the Indian government, particularly in regards to this fuel crisis, bringing China into the fray with all of this fuel and all these memorandums of understanding signed between Nepal and China. You have the pulling out of the military exercises, but going forward with the China-Nepal military exercises. And lastly, you have the recent Nepal-China Transit and Transport Agreement, which allowed China to give Nepal access to these 4 seaports and 3 dry ports on Chinese soil, which really upset Kolkata's dominance in terms of international trade, or even just trade in the region. So it's very important that with India trying to maintain its historic ties with Nepal, it also has to consider that now Nepal has a backdoor in several locations in China to ship its own products to many different countries. And of course, the recent dispute between China and India in the Dokkan Plateau was dangerously close to Nepal. Even though Nepal declared neutrality, that standoff hasn't completely resolved yet, and I don't think it will, so long as China thinks that that area still historically belongs to them. And at the same time, who's to say that if it flares up again, the Indian Army won't bring in the Gorkhas, which have historically been tied to the Indian military movements. At the same time, who's to say that India won't try to ask Nepal to allow its soldiers to move through to expedite troop movements. So there's a lot of different tensions that could still create different kinds of conflict between all 3 countries even, but I would hope that in terms of the way Nepal sees this situation, it's still a very advantageous situation, with the exception of the people in the Terai region who still want to have more representation and more of a say. It still remains to be seen how they view these kinds of initiatives from China, and that would be another step to look at how different individual actors on the ground view their relationship with various Chinese businessmen, diplomatic officials, expats. And because these initiatives have been so new, I think it's hard to find a lot of research on it, particularly in terms of Chinese language resources. Many of them just talk about the core nexus like I am here, and they don't really go into a case-by-case basis of like different relationships between Nepal officials and China. But I'd be very curious to hear if any of you have experience in terms of hearing about China's initiatives in South Asia, or even just experience in Nepal with the political situation and how it's impacted different people on the ground from India or China, or even from Western countries. Any questions?
Yeah, China, so they've signed an agreement to provide up to 33% of the fuel oil for Nepal. Where does it travel?
So it travels to several different points. Actually, this also provides a handy guide for that. So at least before the 2015 earthquake, most of that fuel was able to come through some of these points, but since it increased, it also created a dilemma with some of the border points that had been affected by the earthquake, most notably the Tatopani border, which I believe it's this one right here, but I'm not entirely certain. And so that used to be a main artery between China and Nepal. So that's why Ambassador Yu Hong has been trying to really promote efforts to increase the distribution of this increasing trade.
And these are pre-existing mountain passes, mountain pass roads?
Right, so there, as far as I'm aware, I think there are some mountain pass roads, particularly on the western side. Amy, I don't know if you could also attest to that.
Yeah, they're all old trade routes that are now militarized.
And final on this subject, is this BRI looking at upgrading those roads? I mean, it sounds like the 130-kilometer tunnel could take a little while.
Yes.
So
I mean, there was one travel agency that gave an optimistic estimate that at least towards the China-Nepal border, it could be until 2022, but it's going to be a while. But at the same time, you still have a lot of advocacy from diplomatic channels for trying to restore the passes that were most affected by the earthquake. Tanmo, you had a question?
Just a quick technical question. So, how is the fuel traveling? Like, was it like through pipelines or tankers, right?
Really just fuel trucks.
It's fuel trucks, right.
At least as far as China was concerned. As far as
No, from the Indian routes.
right.
Also like through fuel trucks.
Yeah, as far as I'm aware, it's all fuel trucks. So it was an utter blockade from the Nepal government standpoint. But many people, including several Western countries, considered it a humanitarian crisis just by how limited means the fuel could travel across the border. Yes?
So I have 2 points. The first is an observation, the second is a question. So in the first couple of slides, you sort of presented how China established its presence in the wake of the earthquake, right? Which is quite interesting to think about because that's a strategy that domestic actors often use. So the RSS has used it quite extensively in India, for instance, in the wake of the Gujarat earthquakes. The Yakuza use it in Japan. So it's interesting for me to think about how international actors might also use sort of post-disaster contexts to sort of portray themselves as an amicable group or whatever. And the other,
also the Middle East, right?
yeah. And the question that I have is, do you see the fault lines and support for Chinese involvement along experiences of the fuel crisis, or do you think it goes deeper to say, I don't know, longer-standing ethnic divisions?
I think it's in large part due to the fuel crisis. I would have to say that at least in terms of relations prior to 2015, a lot of the discussion between diplomatic channels between the Nepali government and the China government had been in regards to anti-China activities. And at the same time, while there was, of course, still some trade, you did not have the amount of initiative that China was taking, at least since Xi Jinping had been in power. So I actually haven't looked too much into the time when Xi Jinping took power, between when the fuel crisis actually started. But it seemed as though, at least from my perspective, the fuel crisis was in many ways a catalyst for these various initiatives, and especially in the way that the Oli administration had handled these various crises and was able to win a landslide election following that. It really added a impetus towards China trying to push all of these initiatives. But of course, the relations between China and Nepal go all the way back to the 1950s, and the first instances of road construction came during the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s, but I don't think they were on nearly as massive a scale as they are today, especially because during that time you had much more of a tie between the historic, the Shah dynasty of Nepal and the Indian government. Yes,
Yeah.
Amy.
I got a lot out of this presentation, a lot of information. I have just a couple of comments that might help you further along.
That would be great.
Yeah, so just thinking about the relationship of trading partners and nationalism is fascinating. I wonder if there might be some interest from you to look at the ways that Nepal situated itself vis-a-vis India and China, even as far back as like the 19th century, which, as you have already pointed out, there's a long-standing history of marriage alliances and so forth from Nepal's sort of hill peoples, the Gorkhas that became the Shahs, that became the monarchy, correct?
Right.
And Indian princely states. At the same time, there was aggression from those same dynasties in Nepal towards Tibet and China. So there was the Sino-Nepalese War in the 18th century, which was about the getting control of a mint in Lhasa that was controlled by Nepali subjects who are basically making gold coins. So there's a history there that might be kind of interesting to unpack. I also wonder if, given the fact that at present there's this very exclusive high committee to rethink the Treaty of Peace and Friendship between Nepal and India, so that's an ongoing group of people that are sitting down and trying to figure out now post earthquake, post fuel crisis, post constitution, because now there is obviously a constitution that's functioning in Nepal.
Right.
Do we need to revisit some of the more lax elements of this relationship we have, trading relationship we have with India? So that commission is still meeting, and I wonder if some of the outcomes of that would be in relation to some of these initiatives that China's been pushing, and the 33% of fuel that's now being allowed to be imported by China, which is unprecedented, right?
Yes.
So that might be a site to kind of follow along. That gets reported sometimes in Nepali media, but it's very hush-hush. So you might ask your partner's family for more information about like Nepali language sources that might be reporting on something like that. But
absolutely, and especially with the historic relationship, that was one thing I was trying to consider when devising this kind of presentation as to how far back to go in terms of these kinds of tensions between Nepal, China, and at least during the 19th century, the Tibetan people as well. And I know that there have been many different instances of historic tribute missions that went back and forth between the Qing dynasty and Nepal in general, and you had a recurring basis of establishing those relations. But at the same time, I think one of the things that I've been trying to figure out with this presentation is, because that was ultimately a different political system, I would just try to figure out how to place that in with the rest of these kind of developments which have occurred with a state that props more of a like one China policy.
Just to think about that for a second. So if one of the themes that's interesting to you is nationalism, those historical events are very much prominent in nationalist rhetoric in Nepal. There are ways that India gets represented in the way that China get represented that has a lot to do with relationships that were established through the Gorkha kings and the Shah dynasty, and so events that happened in the 18th and 19th century are very salient in the ways that nationalism gets framed. So it might actually be kind of important, especially if you're thinking about, how Nepali Congress's policies on these two neighbors differs from how the CPN-UML, which is now the Maoist party, which includes the Pushpa Kamal Dahal's Maoist party, right? So it's a different thing now than it was in 2015 entirely. So there's other things to kind of unpack, but it might be interesting to consider the relevancy of certain historical events that predate 1950 to the ways that these policies are being pursued today.
Yes, that would absolutely be an essential next step.
Yeah.
These different transitions between multiple communist parties has always been one of the challenges with explaining the political situation in Nepal, because it's so difficult to unpack at what point in time there was the UML versus at what point in time there was the Maoists, and were there any efforts to combine the parties prior to the 2017 elections and things like that. So that is also something I've been trying to work on in terms of presenting this, and also in terms of the various other parties. Nepali Congress aside, you have several other minor parties that still have a very substantial representation in certain regions of the country. Yeah. And also with what you said about the friendship treaty in terms of how they are renegotiating it, that's my next step in terms of focusing how they will approach these kinds of long-lasting treaties and negotiations with very substantial impacts for generations to come. Any further questions? Yeah.
I was just looking over this slide, and I guess there is this internal discourse among Nepalese about more criticism about the One China policy, and there is feeling towards Tibetan refugees in Nepal. I guess we often describe our country as being trapped between two boulders, India and China. So there is a lot of geopolitical constraints there posed by that. So I'm wondering if what would be an effective, what would being an effective ally to maybe Tibetans look like, or what kind of how do you see Nepal positioned, the position that Nepal has right now between India and China? How do you see that progressing? Or because you've studied this for quite some time, so I'm wondering if you see paths forward where we can become more effective allies for Tibet, and also progress just build better and stronger relations between Nepal and India and Nepal and China.
I think one important step is for the Nepali government to largely acknowledge that these many of the Tibetan communities in Nepal have had these kinds of, in many ways, traumatic experiences. And I think in a large part, many of the Nepali officials who are favorable to China may not necessarily want to understand where a lot of these Tibetans may come from in terms of their history. And I think for them, it may be important for just trying to understand, especially given that there's a lack of knowledge in terms of the 1959 exile of the Dalai Lama, and also these different areas of contention that occurred the next 2 decades after, with the CIA backing different Tibetan movements that were still fighting China in Tibet. I think it's important for the discourse around the Nepali government to not be so much focused on the different responses that the Nepali government took at that time, but understanding the underlying reasons as to why the Tibetans were there, and acknowledging that those same reasons are still the same reasons why they are there today. Amy, I don't know if you would have anything further to add in terms of how they could look at this situation.
Well, I mean, at present, most Tibetans living in Nepal don't have citizenship. So, I mean, the first step might be to give people citizenship. I don't know, but I don't know. That's a very difficult question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking more in terms of honestly, local movements that could help. We don't really have much control over the policies that get drafted. I mean, we're still struggling to get citizenships for children of women, children who don't have a father. We're still struggling for Nepali citizens, right? So we don't really, that is definitely important and on the radar, but what would be some near-term solutions to get the ball rolling towards being more effective allies?
I'm not sure I would actually have an effective answer to that question, especially given that there's been increased suppression of these kinds of different activities, and I know that at least for a lot of Tibetans who are able to escape China, a lot of them just want to keep quiet and to themselves, and the few people that do, it usually only comes out when they know that there has been some increased suppression of their community in China itself. So because the 2008 Beijing Olympics was such a large event that coincided with many of these Tibetan protests, it created a perfect catalyst for a lot of Tibetans across the world to get involved with. But because of the Nepali government's response, which at that year was unprecedented in terms of suppressing those kinds of sentiments, because a lot of times they were also willing to just tolerate those kinds of activities up until then. So with this increased support, I just really am not sure how these activist groups would be able to encourage people to understand the whole Tibetan refugee situation, as well as be able to coordinate with the more active community that's in northern India as well, because Nepal seems to be very intent on trying to control those border entryways and trying to not be perceived by China as letting people in who support anti-China activities or just a more tolerant to Tibet kind of ideology.
Can I ask another question? Do we have time?
Yeah,
Yeah.
we have till 5:30, so yeah.
Okay, so
Yeah, go ahead.
A couple of minutes, yeah.
Okay. I was just curious about whether or not you were aware of the Department of Railroads that's opened up in Kathmandu in Batbatini neighborhood near Balabatar. So the aspirational nature of this is also really, really interesting for me personally to think about. Like, actually, so the infrastructure for the railroad has not been built yet, but the bureaucracy to manage and plan that railroad has been created. Like, there's an actual physical building with an actual physical signboard, and there are actual physical people that go in and out of that building and work, doing what? Who knows? But like, it's very much kind of like, what is it, the cart before the horse almost?
Right.
But is it, like, because you obviously need to plan these things in order for it to come to existence, right? So that in and of itself, for some people, I mean, it is a sign of intent, right? But it's become, at least like amongst my acquaintances, sort of a joke, right? So as you kind of proceed with this work, it might be interesting to pop by that department and just kind of see what's happening there.
Absolutely, yeah, I had heard of it, but I actually wasn't
it's like
certain
2 years
when it.
old.
Okay.
Yeah, 2 years old.
Yeah.
It came up in like 2016 or 17.
Yeah, I mean, especially because China loves to take the initiative with introducing to the Nepali government the railroad from their side of Tibet.
Mm-hmm.
So in some ways, I haven't spent as much time as understanding where Nepal stands with its initiative to try to meet China halfway in the Himalayas.
Yeah, the bullet trains are also like really popular to think about, like for at least like how they get reported and stuff, and thinking about like, oh, there's gonna be a bullet train from Kathmandu to Pokhara, or from Kathmandu to points further east or west, right? And that's sort of a middle way of not a railroad, right? Which you have 130 kilometers of tunneling to do.
Exactly.
But,
I don't know how they're going to start.
Actually get a bullet train between Kathmandu and some other major urban centers inside Nepal, with China's support, obviously, the technology and infrastructure. So
It's incredible.
yeah, it's cool.
Tanmo, you had a question?
Yeah, I mean, it's like still very half baked. So I just, kind of, it's very useful for me, like what you've shown. But I think one of the assumptions here is that, that China's kind of like taking over. It's not, of course, like the capital is kind of flowing in, that there's going to be like this China takeover of this kind of territory, right? Not in a political sense, but like an economic, in sense of influence. But I was wondering, beyond the kind of statecraft of like, policies, legal frameworks, if you kind of think of the ethnographic perspective, which is like how people feel, we might actually have a situation where like, people are kind of perfectly comfortable in like both kind of sovereignties. It's like, people might be happy like being under the shadow of like both India and China. I mean, if you think of like northern Burma, for instance, which is like completely controlled by Chinese capital, but people are like still, they assert like their Kachin sovereignty, their Shan sovereignty, and then also like invoke like China as a reference point, where like, we'll side with China if something goes wrong. So in terms of like everyday struggles, people might actually think of these sovereignties as like kind of references which they mobilize for their like, political kind of ends. Is that like a situation that you see there in Nepal? I mean, say in Northeast India, for instance, like where China kind of pretty much took over in 1962, they kind of came down to Assam. But of course, it was a defeat, massive defeat for India. But people like the territories that they occupied, those people still like, they say we are very, very much Indians today. But if something goes wrong, they'll say, no, it was better for like, we'll side with China if like India doesn't listen to us. So that kind of constant dynamic tension that is operative kind of probably like, points to this situation of like people being comfortable with like all kinds of leviathans or like sovereignties that are around the corner,
Right.
but not being kind of committed to one of them like exclusively. So, but that I think you can always like get only after like, probably like through an ethnographic study, which is beyond the mandate of this paper. But I just kind of something to think about if you kind of want to go deep on this topic.
Right. I think one of the aspects of parts to explore further has definitely been trying to determine how individual people respond to this increasing presence of Chinese infrastructural initiatives, and also in terms of this kind of election assistance. I don't know how many of them were actually aware that China was also giving this money as opposed to the normal actors, but especially because there's always a very different discourse between what the hill people in the Kathmandu Valley say and the rest of Nepal, and that's also further divided by where you are in the Terai region, and also where you are around the border that touches China. And I would also be very interested to hear more opinions, not only about the actors who caused a lot of the blockades for the fuel crisis, but also in terms of where you had the Maoist uprising, particularly in Rolpa and those areas, and how they would view this, especially because they were the ones who, at least in the early stages of the Civil War, were welcoming to these kinds of Maoist initiatives, which largely originated from China and were still thriving long after China had opened up to the rest of the world. So especially those two areas would be where I would like to look at next for this.
Great, thank you so much, Daniel.
Thank you all for coming.
Please take some samosas on your way out, maybe 5 or 6 each.